Menk, meaning we in Armenian, is a literary group that came together in the late 1920s. A group of orphans that, having survived the genocide, ended up in Paris and wanted to launch a literary journal with that same name, Menk. Following the Armenian genocide, about 65,000 survivors from the violent onslaught made their way to France as refugees. They settled along the southern coastal cities, along the Marseille to Paris railway, and in Paris. And Paris here is interesting because there was already an intellectual community there. It was some sort of a center prior to the genocide. And because of the existing network and platforms available, these intellectuals that had survived wanted to quickly recreate the cultural, political milieu of Constantinople in Paris. And this is when we see the political parties being reactivated in the diaspora. Publishing houses soon started forming, printing presses. We see an explosion of literary, cultural, political life in Paris. And this is really the scene from which Menk emerges. Some of the more notable names in Menk are Shahan Shahnur, Zarevor Puni, Shavash Nartuni, Nigoros Sarafyan, Nisham Beşiktaşlian. They sought to create a collective of dispersed Armenian writers, and perhaps this is why they called themselves we. They wanted to start something new, and they saw the journal and their smaller gathering as the stepping stone to a larger gathering of writers from across diasporan communities, dispersed communities. The first issue of Menk came out in 1931. In their first volume, we see a collection of poems, short stories, and also editorial type writing in which they try to position themselves as a voice for their generation, as a new group of writers. The volume is also preceded by a one-page announcement signed by all 14 members of the group. The platform that they're serving in this manifesto-like announcement is a disruptive one. They positioned themselves as the voice of their generation. And they very much positioned themselves against the writers that were active in the pre-1915 era. The platform that Menk tried to cultivate centered mainly around these three principles. They were to narrate the present. They weren't going to narrate the story of the genocide. They were not going to speak about the past in their writings, rather focus on their exilic condition as survivors in Paris. 2, to write in the exilic language, which is Western Armenian. And 3, to develop the genre that they thought was least developed by their predecessors, that of the novel. If we were to consider a canon for Menk, we would have to place within there Shahan Shahnur's 1929 novel, Nahancha Aransierki, translated as The Retreat Without Song, Zarevor Puni's 1929 novel, The Attempt, Portsa in Armenian, Nigoros Sarafyan's short story, Ishkhanuhin, The Princess, Shahan Shahnur's short story, Buynuzlınera, The Cuckolds, and Vorpuni's short story, Vartsusenyag, Room for Rent. What's interesting about Menk is that when we think of an orphan generation producing fiction, we tend to expect narratives of the genocide, stories of their survival. And what's interesting is that we see a complete absence of the past. They're very much narrating their experience in Paris as survivors, of course, but in the absence of past memory. You see in their writings, especially if we take the example of Zarevor Puni's writings, the larger aesthetic trend of Europe, say surrealism. We can even look at their call for breaking from the past and their stance against what they called the fathers of literature, Western Armenian literature, as a modernist act, as something that is contemporaneous with their current trends and aesthetic movements of the time in rejecting, the figure of the father and starting this new reign in the 20th century. They were very much contemporary voices. So Shavash Misakian, the editor of Harach, the daily newspaper that had the widest circulation at the time, very often published their short fiction, their poetry, their novels in serial form. So the contemporary audience in diaspora communities knew them, but somehow they get washed under the rug. Menk as a group, both in their literary journals and their journalistic writings and their fiction, has been for the large part overlooked and not included in the canon of diaspora literature or Western Armenian literature, if we could call it a canon, of course. Their literature remains, for the most part, inaccessible, for diaspora institutions have not republished them. For the most part, they have not been translated at large. And part of the reason for Menk being overlooked, I think, is precisely their platform, their positioning in terms of literary belonging, their rejection of the past, and their refusal to offer an explicit account of the genocide. I think Menk offers us an archive that can supplement how we understand post-genocide literature or literary responses to the genocide. In their work, we can see the problems, complications of aesthetic representation to a catastrophe. They're very much writing and they're very much narrating, they're representing the experience of catastrophe through a series of impossibilities. And if we try to theorize catastrophe and understand it from the experience point of view and sort of define it as an experience that very much defies meaning making, then we can turn to their literature and find representation of the genocide there.